American politics has never been short of drama, but some scandals are so bizarre they seem straight out of a soap opera. Picture this: a congressman caught on tape accepting bribes in a hot tub, a governor disappearing for days only to resurface claiming he was hiking the Appalachian Trail while secretly visiting his mistress in Argentina, or a senator staging a fake assassination attempt to boost his popularity. These aren't plot twists from a Netflix series, they're real moments from U.S. political history that defy belief. And today, we're diving deep into the wildest, most unbelievable scandals that prove truth is often stranger than fiction. You might think you've heard it all: Watergate, Monica Lewinsky, the occasional campaign finance violation, but trust me, the stories we're about to uncover will make those seem almost tame. From secret love children hidden for decades to elected officials using taxpayer money to fund their pet llama's lifestyle, the American political arena has seen it all. What makes these scandals so gripping isn't just the shock value, it's the sheer audacity, the jaw-dropping lack of self-awareness, and the moments when power and absurdity collide in ways that leave you questioning how any of this could have happened in real life. So why do these stories matter? Because they're more than just gossip or tabloid fodder. They're windows into the quirks, flaws, and sometimes downright delusions of the people we've entrusted with power. They remind us that politics isn't just about policies and speeches. It's about human beings with all their messy, unpredictable, and occasionally hilarious failings. Whether it's a mayor smuggling drugs in his underwear or a presidential candidate claiming he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue without losing voters, these scandals reveal the darker and often funnier side of democracy in action. Buckle up, because this isn't just a history lesson, it's a roller coaster ride through the most outrageous moments in American politics, and you won't believe what's coming next. Long before modern political scandals made headlines, one of the most brazen cases of corruption in U.S. history unfolded in the 1920s, the Teapot Dome Scandal. It all revolved around something as mundane as government-owned oil fields, but the sheer audacity of the scheme would leave the nation stunned. The story begins under President Warren G. Harding's administration, when his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, quietly handed over lucrative oil drilling rights in Wyoming's Teapot Dome Reserve and California's Elk Hills to private oil companies. Sounds like standard bureaucracy, right? Except Fall wasn't acting in the public's interest. He was stuffing his own pockets with bribes totaling over $400,000, equivalent to millions today. What makes this scandal so jaw-dropping isn't just the greed, it's the clumsy attempts to hide it. Fall tried to justify the no-bid contracts by claiming national security, arguing the Navy needed the oil. But investigators quickly noticed his sudden lavish lifestyle. A brand new ranch, expensive livestock, and stacks of cash mysteriously appearing in his pockets. Even more absurd, some of the bribes were delivered in literal black satchels, like something out of a gangster movie. When the press caught wind, Fall's excuses unraveled faster than a cheap suit. The Senate launched an investigation, and for the first time ever, a cabinet member was convicted of a felony and sentenced to prison. The fallout was catastrophic for Harding's legacy, though he never lived to see the full extent of it, dying suddenly in office before the scandal exploded. Teapot Dome became synonymous with political corruption, a cautionary tale of power unchecked. But here's the twisted irony. While Fall went down in history as a crook, the oil companies involved faced barely a slap on the wrist. It was a glaring reminder that in politics, sometimes the little guys take the fall while the powerful walk away unscathed. And yet, this was just the beginning, the first in a long, bizarre line of scandals that would prove no era of American politics is immune to sheer, unchecked audacity. Albert Fall's downfall wasn't just a personal disgrace, it rewrote the rules of political accountability in America. After a sensational trial that captivated the nation, Fall was convicted of accepting bribes in 1929, marking the first time a sitting cabinet member was sent to prison for crimes committed in office. The image of a high-ranking official trading public resources for personal wealth was so shocking it forced Washington to confront its own culture of corruption. But here's the twist. While Fall served a year behind bars, the oil tycoons who bribed him, they walked away with fines so light they barely qualified as a slap on the wrist. This glaring double standard exposed a harsh truth: the system was rigged to punish the middlemen while letting the powerful off the hook. The scandal's ripple effects were immediate. Congress passed new laws requiring competitive bidding for government oil leases, and for a brief moment it seemed like transparency might win. But the real legacy of Teapot Dome was subtler. It became the playbook for every political scandal that followed. Future corrupt officials learned from Fall's mistakes, opting for offshore accounts and shell companies over satchels of cash. And yet, the fundamental blueprint stayed the same: deny everything, blame the press, and if caught, drag out the legal process until public outrage fades. What's most haunting isn't the crime itself, but how little ultimately changed. Fall's conviction was supposed to be a warning, proof that no one was above the law. Instead, it revealed how easily the system could absorb scandal without real reform. Over the decades, Teapot Dome would be name-dropped in every major corruption case, from Watergate to Jack Abramoff's lobbying scheme, as a shorthand for political greed. But each time, the same questions lingered. Why do we keep being surprised? And when the next scandal breaks, will we actually hold power accountable, or just settle for another sacrificial fall guy? The irony is almost poetic. A century later, Fall's name is synonymous with disgrace, while the oil barons who enabled him faded into obscurity. It's a pattern that repeats like clockwork: the illusion of justice, the theater of congressional hearings, and in the end, business as usual. Teapot Dome didn't just expose one man's corruption, it revealed the rot at the heart of the system. And as we'll see again and again in these scandals, the most unbelievable part isn't the crime. It's how rarely the powerful face real consequences. If Teapot Dome showed how greed could corrupt the highest levels of government, the whiskey ring scandal of the 1870s proved corruption could become downright systemic, a machine greased with liquor and taxpayer dollars. At first glance, the scheme seemed simple. Distillers and federal agents teamed up to cheat the government out of whiskey tax revenues, pocketing millions while President Ulysses S. Grant's administration looked the other way, but the sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of officials across multiple states, all working in concert to defraud the very system they were sworn to uphold. The mechanics of the scam were almost comically brazen. Distillers would underreport their whiskey production, sometimes by as much as half, while corrupt tax collectors knowingly accepted falsified reports. The stolen tax money would then be split between the distillers and the officials, with kickbacks flowing up the chain like fine bourbon. At its peak, the ring was skimming nearly $2.5 million a year, an astronomical sum at the time, right under the nose of the Treasury Department. What made it even more outrageous, many of the ringleaders were Civil War heroes, men who'd once fought to preserve the Union only to turn around and plunder it. The scandal's unraveling came thanks to one stubborn Treasury official, Benjamin Bristow, who noticed whiskey production numbers didn't match tax revenues. When he launched a surprise raid in 1875, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Ledgers stuffed with false entries, safes overflowing with untaxed cash, and even coded telegrams between conspirators. Over 200 people were eventually indicted, including Grant's own private secretary, Orville Babcock, who'd been accepting bribes via encrypted messages signed with the alias Sylph. The president's loyalty to Babcock became its own spectacle. Grant personally intervened to defend him, leaving many to wonder how much he'd known all along. But the real irony, the whiskey ring wasn't just about greed. It was a twisted byproduct of Reconstruction-era politics. The liquor tax had been imposed to help pay war debts, burdening Southern distillers who saw it as Northern oppression. For some, cheating the system felt like rebellion. Yet the scandal's fallout exposed a darker truth: corruption didn't discriminate by region or party. It thrived wherever power went unchecked, from St. Louis whiskey warehouses to Washington backrooms. And while a few scapegoats served prison time, most conspirators slipped away with fines or pardons, proving once again that accountability in politics often depends on who you know, not what you've done. The whiskey ring didn't just steal money, it distilled the essence of political rot into one intoxicating lesson. When the guardians of the law become its greatest violators, the system isn't just broken, it's drunk on its own power. Ulysses S. Grant's presidency is often remembered as one of the most corrupt in American history, a time when cronyism and bribery ran rampant. Yet the whiskey ring scandal revealed a startling contradiction. The man at the top, often painted as oblivious or complicit, turned out to be its most furious opponent. When Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow first brought evidence of the conspiracy to Grant, the president's reaction shocked everyone. Instead of sweeping it under the rug to protect his administration, Grant issued one of the most dramatic orders of his presidency: let no guilty man escape. For a leader whose legacy would later be defined by scandal, this moment showed a side of Grant few expected: unyielding moral clarity in the face of corruption. What makes Grant's stance so remarkable is the personal cost. Among the accused was his longtime friend and private secretary, Orville Babcock, a man so close to the president that they'd exchanged secret coded telegrams for years. When investigators uncovered Babcock's involvement, Grant could have easily shielded him. Other presidents had done far worse to protect allies, but Grant did the unthinkable. He allowed the prosecution to move forward, even testifying at Babcock's trial. The spectacle was unprecedented, a sitting president taking the stand against his own inner circle. Though Babcock was ultimately acquitted, thanks in part to Grant's own glowing character testimony, the message was clear: no one, not even the president's confidants, was above the law. This moment should have reshaped Grant's legacy. Here was a leader willing to burn his own administration to the ground for the sake of integrity. But history has a funny way of simplifying complexity. The whiskey ring became just another footnote in the long list of Grant-era scandals, overshadowed by later controversies like the Petticoat Mobilier Affair. The irony is staggering: the very president who took unprecedented steps to root out corruption would forever be remembered as presiding over one of the most corrupt administrations. Part of the problem was timing. By the time the whiskey ring trials concluded, public faith in Grant's leadership had already eroded. The stench of other scandals clung to him, making even his righteous actions seem like desperate damage control. And then there was the Babcock paradox. Grant's insistence on testifying for his friend while demanding others face justice left a bitter aftertaste. Was this principle or favoritism? The ambiguity haunted his reputation, but perhaps the most telling detail lies in what happened next. After the scandal, Grant doubled down on civil service reform, pushing for laws to prevent future corruption. Yet Congress blocked him at every turn, proving how deeply entrenched the system was. In the end, Grant's battle against the whiskey ring wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was a doomed attempt to clean up a government that didn't want to be cleaned. That tension between personal integrity and systemic rot would define his presidency long after the whiskey barrels stopped rolling. The Petticoat Mobilier scandal of 1872 wasn't just corruption, it was corruption with receipts. While the whiskey ring had been a chaotic free-for-all, this scheme was cold, calculated, and almost elegant in its brazenness. At its heart stood the Union Pacific Railroad, a company that had been handed millions in government subsidies to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But instead of laying track, a group of executives decided to lay the groundwork for one of the most audacious political heists in American history, their weapon of choice. A dummy construction company called Credit Mobilier, designed to funnel taxpayer dollars straight into their pockets while Congress looked the other way, because half of Congress was already on the payroll. Here's how the scam worked. Union Pacific's insiders set up Credit Mobilier as the sole contractor for the railroad's construction, then charged the government exorbitant fees for shoddy work. The overcharges were staggering. Some estimates put the theft at $23 million, nearly $500 million in today's money. But the real genius was in the distribution. To ensure no one in Washington asked too many questions, Credit Mobilier's directors handed out shares of their phantom company to key congressmen, including the sitting vice president, Schuyler Colfax. These weren't just bribes, they were investments, paying dividends as long as the politicians kept the gravy train rolling. The scandal might have stayed hidden if not for a bitter feud between two railroad executives that spilled into the newspapers. When the New York Sun got hold of incriminating letters in 1872, the details read like a crime novel. One congressman had received shares worth $343,000 in today's money. Another, future President James Garfield, accepted loans that suspiciously never had to be repaid. The House launched an investigation so explosive it ended with 2 members censured, but not a single person went to jail. What made Credit Mobilier different from earlier scandals was its sheer institutionalization. This wasn't a handful of bad apples, it was a systemic infection. The railroad barons hadn't just bribed individuals, they'd effectively purchased an entire branch of government, and the public response was volcanic. For the first time, Americans saw proof that Congress wasn't just incompetent, it was actively complicit in robbing them blind. The fallout reshaped the 1872 election, with President Grant distancing himself from his own vice president, and reform candidates sweeping into office on promises to drain the swamp, a phrase that's never really gone out of style. Yet the most telling detail came after the headlines faded. While Credit Mobilier's ringleaders faced public disgrace, nearly all kept their stolen fortunes. The railroad contract stood, the tracks remained, and the lesson was clear. In America, you could cheat the government and still come out ahead, as long as you cut in the right people. It was a playbook that would inspire generations of lobbyists, a reminder that sometimes the most damaging corruption isn't the kind that breaks the law, but the kind that rights it. The Credit Mobilier scandal didn't just expose a few crooked politicians, it revealed an entire Congress swimming in conflicts of interest. Nearly a third of sitting lawmakers, including the vice president and multiple future presidential candidates, had accepted bribes disguised as investment opportunities. Yet when the dust settled, only 2 representatives faced any real consequences, censure, not prison. The rest, they walked away with little more than bruised reputations, proof that in Washington, accountability often stopped where connections began. Public fury reached a boiling point when investigative reports laid bare the scale of the scheme. Newspapers printed damning lists of implicated officials, their names alongside the dollar amounts they'd pocketed. One particularly brazen congressman, Oaks Ames, had personally distributed shares like candy, later defending himself by claiming, "I took in those I wanted to punish me." The arrogance was staggering, politicians treating bribes as inside jokes while taxpayers footed the bill. But the real scandal wasn't the corruption itself, it was the system's refusal to punish it. Reformers seized the moment, demanding laws to prevent government officials from holding financial stakes in projects they oversaw. The outcry even forced Congress to establish its first ever ethics committee, a hollow victory, since the same body promptly whitewashed its own investigations. Most damning of all, many implicated lawmakers won re-election, their careers barely dented. The message was clear: voters might rage against corruption in the abstract, but local loyalties and party machines often trumped principle. What lingers most about Credit Mobilier isn't the greed, it's the blueprint it created. Future scandals, from Teapot Dome to modern lobbying excesses, would follow the same playbook. flood the zone with campaign donations, sprinkle favors to key allies, and count on public outrage to fade before real change could take root. The 1870s taught America a painful lesson. When corruption becomes institutionalized, punishing a few scapegoats does nothing to dismantle the machine. And as we'll see again and again, that machine has only grown more sophisticated with time. Just a decade after the American Revolution, the young United States found itself staring down a diplomatic crisis so absurd it almost defied belief: the XYZ Affair. Picture this: 3 American envoys arrive in France in 1797, hoping to smooth over tensions between the two former allies. Instead of a warm welcome, they're met by a trio of French agents, later anonymized in documents as X, Y, and Z, who deliver an astonishing demand. Before any negotiations could begin, America would need to pay France a $250,000 bribe plus provide a $12 million loan to fund France's wars. Oh, and one more thing, U.S. officials would also need to personally apologize for critical remarks made about the French government. It wasn't diplomacy, it was straight-up extortion with a powdered wig. When news of this shakedown reached President John Adams, his response was legendary. He refused to name the French agents in his report to Congress, referring to them only by those now infamous letters, hence the XYZ Affair. But Adams didn't mince words about France's audacity, declaring their demands a stain on national honor. The American public erupted. Suddenly, pro-French sentiment from the Revolutionary War era evaporated overnight, replaced by a wave of outrage so intense that crowds burned effigies of French officials in the streets. Newspapers splashed the scandal across their pages, turning millions for defense but not 1 cent for tribute into a national rallying cry. The aftermath was both dramatic and ironic. Though no formal war was declared, the U.S. and France spent the next 2 years locked in a bizarre, quasi-war naval skirmishes between frigates, privateers seizing each other's ships, all while diplomats kept up the pretense that neither country was technically at war. It was like watching 2 neighbors smash each other's mailboxes while insisting they were still friends. The absurdity reached its peak when American forces captured nearly 90 French vessels, only for France to suddenly back down and reopen negotiations, this time without the bribes. What makes the XYZ Affair so unforgettable isn't just the gall of the French demands, it's how perfectly it exposed the raw nerve of American pride. Here was a nation barely out of its infancy, refusing to kneel to the very empire that had helped birth it. And in a twist Adams himself couldn't have predicted, the scandal became the making of the U.S. Navy. The public fury over France's insults spurred Congress to finally fund a real naval force, laying the groundwork for the fleet that would later dominate the War of 1812. Yet the real lesson of XYZ wasn't about military might, it was about the price of respect. France had assumed America would fold under pressure, treating it like a debtor nation instead of an equal. Their miscalculation cost them dearly. Within years, Napoleon would sell Louisiana to the U.S. for a song, effectively handing over a continent to the same country he'd tried to strong-arm. Sometimes history's greatest scandals don't just reveal corruption, they reveal the moment a nation decides it's done being pushed around. And for America, that moment came with 3 cryptic letters and a refusal to pay for the privilege of being heard. The quasi-war that followed the XYZ Affair was one of the strangest conflicts in American history, a war without a declaration, fought entirely at sea, where neither side would admit they were actually fighting. French privateers began seizing American merchant ships by the dozens, while the fledgling U.S. Navy, still just a handful of frigates, struck back with surprising force. In less than 2 years, American warships captured nearly 90 French vessels, including the infamous showdown where the USS Constellation battered the French L'Insurgent into submission off the Caribbean coast. Yet through it all, diplomats on both sides kept insisting this wasn't really a war, just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings between friends, the irony was thick enough to cut with a saber. France, America's revolutionary ally, was now attacking its ships while the U.S., which had spent years avoiding European entanglements, found itself locked in naval combat. But beneath the absurdity lay a serious shift in American politics. President John Adams, once a Francophile, now faced pressure from his own Federalist Party to go even further, not just defending U.S. ships but cracking down on potential enemies within. Their solution, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, a set of laws so controversial they'd make modern debates over immigration and free speech look tame. The Sedition Act, in particular, was a bombshell. It made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government, a direct assault on the First Amendment. Over 20 newspaper editors, mostly from the opposing Democratic-Republican Party, were arrested, some for simply calling Adams a mock monarch. Meanwhile, the Alien Acts gave the president power to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous, a thinly veiled threat against French immigrants and Jeffersonian supporters. The backlash was instant. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison secretly authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing states could nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional, a radical idea that would echo decades later in the lead up to the Civil War. What makes this scandal resonate today is how perfectly it encapsulates the tension between security and liberty. Adams, facing what he saw as an existential threat from France, chose to sacrifice civil liberties in the name of national stability, a trade-off we've seen repeated in nearly every American crisis since, from the Red Scare to the Patriot Act. The Sedition Act's prosecutions became a cautionary tale about government overreach, yet the same impulses persist whenever fear outweighs principle. And then there's the foreign interference angle. France had tried to manipulate American politics through backroom deals and economic pressure, an 18th-century version of election meddling. The XYZ Affair became America's first wake-up call to the dangers of foreign influence, a lesson that feels eerily relevant in an age of cyberattacks and disinformation campaigns. The Quasi-War might have ended with Napoleon's rise and a peace treaty in 1800, but the questions it raised never really went away. How far should a government go to protect itself? Where's the line between vigilance and paranoia? And when the next crisis comes, will we remember the mistakes of 1798, or are we doomed to repeat them? In the end, the Quasi-War's legacy wasn't just sunken ships or political feuds. It was the moment America learned that the greatest threats to democracy don't always come from foreign fleets. Sometimes they come from the choices we make when we're afraid. Adams himself would later call the Alien and Sedition Acts the biggest regret of his presidency, proving even the architects of overreach can recognize their mistakes if history gives them enough time to look back. Washington in the 1830s wasn't just the seat of American power. It was a pressure cooker of gossip, backstabbing, and social climbing where even the most powerful men could be brought to their knees by the whims of their wives. Enter Margaret Peggy Eaton, the vivacious and controversial wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, whose past became the unlikely spark for one of the most bizarre political meltdowns in U.S. history. Peggy was everything D.C.'s high society women despised, a tavern keeper's daughter, a widow rumored to have had affairs, and worst of all, unapologetically unashamed of either. When Eaton married her shortly after her first husband's death, whispers spread like wildfire. Had they been carrying on while her husband was alive? Was she even respectable enough to sit at the same dinner table as cabinet wives? The scandal that followed wasn't just petty, it would tear apart Andrew Jackson's administration and redefine the role of personal morality in politics. The ringleader of this social coup was Floride Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, who made it her mission to freeze Peggy out of Washington's elite circles. Cabinet wives refused to attend events where Peggy was present, turned their backs on her at receptions and spread salacious stories about her past. The irony was staggering. These women, who had no formal political power, were wielding social exclusion like a weapon, forcing their husbands to choose between loyalty to the administration and peace at home. Even Jackson's own niece, Emily Donaldson, who served as White House hostess, joined the boycott, leaving the president caught between family and his staunch defense of the Eatons. Jackson's fury over the matter wasn't just principled, it was deeply personal. His late wife, Rachel, had endured similar smears during his presidential campaign, with opponents accusing her of bigamy due to a technicality in her divorce from her first husband. The stress of those rumors haunted Rachel to her grave, and Jackson blamed her premature death on what he called the wicked machinations of hypocrites. Now, watching history repeat itself with Peggy, he saw red. "She is as chaste as a virgin," he thundered to anyone who'd listen, even convening a cabinet meeting to debate Peggy's virtue like some medieval morality tribunal. The Petticoat Affair exposed a raw nerve in early American politics, the double standard that judged women by impossible standards while forgiving men far worse. John Eaton's predecessor as Secretary of War, for example, had openly kept a mistress yet faced no social exile. But a woman like Peggy, who dared to be charming, outspoken, and unbroken by gossip. Unforgivable, Jackson's attempts to mediate only made things worse. At one White House dinner, he placed Peggy in the seat of honor beside him, forcing cabinet wives to either acknowledge her or publicly defy the president. They chose defiance, sparking a crisis that eventually forced Jackson to purge his entire cabinet, except for the Postmaster General, the only member whose wife had refused to join the boycott. What started as drawing room drama spiraled into national consequences. The cabinet reshuffle weakened Vice President Calhoun's influence, paving the way for Martin Van Buren, a shrewd politician who'd openly supported the Eatons, to become Jackson's heir apparent. Van Buren's ascent would reshape American politics for decades, proving that in Washington, even the smallest slights could alter the course of history. The Petticoat Affair's real legacy wasn't just about Peggy Eaton's reputation, it was about who held power in a society that pretended women had none. These cabinet wives, barred from voting or holding office, had found a way to sway policy through the only means available to them, social warfare. And Jackson, for all his bluster about honor, couldn't defeat an enemy that operated in whispers and teacup snubs. It was a scandal that proved politics wasn't fought just in Congress or on battlefields, but in ballrooms, parlors, and the unrelenting court of public opinion where women, quietly but decisively, held the gavel. Andrew Jackson wasn't a man who accepted defeat lightly, especially not in battles of honor. When his attempts to broker peace between Peggy Eaton and Washington's high society failed, he didn't just fume privately, he launched a full-scale purge. The cabinet, once filled with trusted allies, became a battleground of loyalty. Jackson demanded written statements from every cabinet member attesting to Peggy's virtue, a surreal request that turned government officials into unwilling characters in a morality play. When several refused or gave half-hearted endorsements, Jackson saw betrayal. His solution: reshuffle the entire administration in what historians now call the Eaton malaria, a political fever so intense it cleared the room of nearly everyone but the Postmaster General, whose wife had remained neutral. The fallout was catastrophic for governance. While Jackson obsessed over drawing room slights, critical issues like the bank war and Native American removal policies took a backseat. Cabinet meetings devolved into awkward silences or shouting matches over Peggy's reputation rather than national crises. Even foreign diplomats noticed the absurdity. The British minister reported home that American politics had become a contest of petticoats. But Jackson's rage wasn't just about Peggy, it was about power. The same women snubbing Eaton were wives of men like Vice President Calhoun, who'd been undermining Jackson's authority on states' rights. By forcing the cabinet purge, Jackson wasn't just defending a woman's honor, he was decapitating a faction that threatened his presidency. The irony: Peggy Eaton's scandal inadvertently handed Jackson his greatest political victory. By ousting Calhoun's allies, he cleared the path for Martin Van Buren, the sly New York politician who'd ingratiated himself by openly socializing with the Eatons. Van Buren's reward, the vice presidency and eventually the White House, proving that in Jackson's Washington, even soap opera drama could reshape the line of succession. But the real casualty was governance itself. For nearly 2 years, the Petticoat Affair consumed oxygen needed for substantive debates, leaving Jackson's opponents to wonder, had the presidency been reduced to a referee in a salon feud? What lingers most about this episode isn't just the pettiness, it's how personal grudges can hijack an entire government. Jackson's inability to move past the slights against Peggy Eaton revealed a blinding paradox. The same stubbornness that made him a fierce leader also made him wage pointless wars. By the time the scandal faded, thanks largely to Peggy leaving Washington after her husband resigned, the administration's momentum had been squandered. The Petticoat Affair became a cautionary tale about the high cost of mixing personal vendettas with public duty, a lesson that echoes whenever politics becomes more about theater than governing. And in a final twist worthy of Shakespeare, Peggy outlived her detractors by decades, remarrying a wealthy Italian dancing instructor and living her final years in European luxury, proof that sometimes history's losers get the last laugh. While the XYZ Affair was straining America's relations with France, another bombshell was about to explode much closer to home, one that would prove even the highest-ranking officials weren't immune to treason. Enter Senator William Blount of Tennessee, a founding father with a resume that included signing the U.S. Constitution and governing the Southwest Territory. By 1797, he should have been a respected elder statesman. Instead, he became the first and so far only U.S. senator ever expelled for plotting to betray his country in one of the most brazen land grabs in American history. The scheme reads like a bad spy novel. Blount, deep in debt from land speculation, hatched a plan to help Britain seize Spanish-controlled Florida and Louisiana. His motivations were equal parts greed and desperation. He'd invested heavily in Western lands whose value would skyrocket if the Spanish were pushed out, and he was willing to drag an entire nation into war to save his own fortune. The plot involved recruiting frontiersmen, Cherokee allies, and even British naval support to launch an attack. But here's where it gets surreal. Blount laid all this out in a handwritten letter which promptly fell into the hands of President John Adams. The document's discovery sent shockwaves through Philadelphia, then the nation's capital. The fallout was unprecedented. The Senate convened in emergency session, with Federalists and Democratic Republicans momentarily setting aside their bitter feud to confront the unthinkable, a sitting senator colluding with a foreign power against American interests. Blount's defense: he claimed the letter was private correspondence, not official treason. But the evidence was damning. His own handwriting detailed plans to arm insurgents and provoke a conflict. In a landmark vote, the Senate expelled him by a margin of 25-1, marking the first time Congress had ever removed one of its own. What makes the Blount conspiracy so bizarre isn't just the betrayal, it's the aftermath. Despite being impeached by the House, Blount never faced trial. The Senate, in a move that reeked of political protection, ruled that members of Congress couldn't be impeached, only expelled. Blount slunk back to Tennessee, where locals greeted him as a folk hero rather than a traitor. Within years, he was elected to the state legislature, proving that in early America, frontier loyalty often trumped national disgrace. The scandal exposed a tension that still resonates today, the clash between personal ambition and public trust. Blount wasn't some rogue ideologue. He was a blueprint for the corrupt politician, willing to sell out his country for a quick profit. His expulsion set a vital precedent, showing even the powerful weren't above consequences. Yet his escape from real punishment also revealed a sobering truth. In politics, sometimes the worst crimes don't stick. The Blount conspiracy wasn't just a historical footnote. It was America's first taste of how far the influential might go to save themselves and how often the system lets them walk away. William Blount's expulsion from the Senate should have been the start of his downfall, but in a twist that perfectly exposed the flaws in America's early legal system, he never faced a trial. The House impeached him swiftly, charging him with high crimes and misdemeanors. Yet when the case reached the Senate, something extraordinary happened. The very body that had kicked him out now shielded him with a technicality so glaring it redefined congressional accountability for centuries. Senators argued with straight faces that members of Congress weren't civil officers subject to impeachment under the Constitution. In other words, expulsion was their only tool, and they'd already used it. The case collapsed, leaving Blount free to return to Tennessee like a disgraced aristocrat retreating to his estate. This wasn't just a legal footnote, it was a seismic shift in how power worked in America. By letting Blount walk, Congress effectively created a two-tiered justice system, one for ordinary citizens and another for politicians who could hide behind procedural shields. The precedent stuck like glue. Future scandals, from credit Mobilier to modern ethics violations, would echo this same theme. Punish the symbolic scapegoat, but let the system protect its own. Even Blount seemed baffled by his luck, writing to a friend, "I am out of the scrape, though not honorably." That understatement barely scratched the surface. His scrape had included plotting with a foreign power to redraw the map of North America, yet he faced less consequence than a shoplifter. The irony cuts deeper when you consider who was held accountable. Blount's co-conspirators, frontiersmen, and lower-level agents faced actual indictments. One, a Tennessee judge named David Henley, was dragged to trial while Blount sipped whiskey in Knoxville. The message couldn't have been clearer. In the New Republic, some men were untouchable by design. Legal scholars still debate whether the Senate's reasoning was correct or a self-serving dodge, but the practical effect was undeniable. For the next 200 years, no senator or representative would ever be convicted in an impeachment trial, not even when caught taking bribes or covering up crimes. The Blount case didn't just set a precedent, it built a firewall between power and consequence. What makes this scandal timeless isn't just the audacity of Blount's scheme, it's how perfectly it mirrors modern political scandals. Replace British spies with Russian oligarchs or Spanish Florida with offshore bank accounts, and the playbook feels eerily familiar. The same questions haunt us when the powerful break the rules. Who actually gets punished? And how many loopholes were carved into the system from the very beginning? Blount's story should have been a warning. Instead, it became an instruction manual. Aaron Burr might be the only vice president in U.S. history who shot a founding father while still in office. The infamous duel with Alexander Hamilton in 1804 was just the opening act of what would become one of the most surreal political downfalls in American history. Fresh off that fatal confrontation, Burr didn't retreat into disgrace, he doubled down on ambition, allegedly masterminding a plot to carve his own empire out of the American Southwest. Whether it was treason or just wild speculation run amok, the so-called Burr conspiracy revealed how thin the line between statesman and renegade could be in the early republic. At its core, Burr's scheme, if it even was a scheme, was equal parts audacious and bizarre. The rumors swirled that he'd been recruiting frontiersmen, gathering weapons, and negotiating with foreign powers to either seize Spanish-held territories or detach chunks of the young United States itself. Some whispered he planned to crown himself Emperor of Louisiana. Others claimed he wanted to ignite a war with Spain and profit from the chaos. The truth was likely messier, muddied by Burr's knack for secrecy and the paranoia of his enemies, including President Thomas Jefferson, who'd once been his running mate. The irony was delicious. Here was a man who'd nearly become president, losing to Jefferson only after an electoral college tie. now accused of plotting against the very government he'd helped build. Burr's trial for treason in 1807 became a national spectacle, with Chief Justice John Marshall presiding, and the prosecution's star witness turning out to be the unreliable General James Wilkinson, a man who'd been secretly on Spain's payroll himself. The legal showdown hinged on the Constitution's strict definition of treason, levying war against the U.S. or adhering to their enemies. Marshall's eventual ruling was a bombshell. Burr hadn't committed treason because he hadn't been caught in open rebellion. Without an actual army marching under his flag, the conspiracy remained just talk. Burr walked free, but his reputation never recovered. The man who'd once been a Revolutionary War hero, a Senate power broker, and Jefferson's vice president now slunk into European exile, trying and failing to sell his empire-building schemes to the British and French. When he finally returned to America, he lived out his days as a forgotten relic, practicing law under an assumed name while the nation he'd helped shape moved on without him. What makes the Burr conspiracy so fascinating isn't whether it was real, it's how perfectly it captures the fragile chaos of early America. This was a time when borders were fluid, loyalties were negotiable, and a charismatic figure with the right connections might just rewrite the map. Burr wasn't some outlier, he was a product of his era where ambition often outpaced law. His story forces us to ask, was he a traitor or just a man who saw the West not as a frontier but as a blank slate? And in a young nation still figuring out its own rules, was there really a difference? Aaron Burr's treason trial in 1807 wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a showdown between two titans of early America, with the Constitution itself hanging in the balance. On one side stood President Thomas Jefferson, Burr's former ally turned bitter enemy who'd orchestrated his arrest and now demanded conviction. On the other, Chief Justice John Marshall, Jefferson's cousin and lifelong rival, who saw the case as a chance to define or dismantle presidential power. The stage was set in Richmond, Virginia, where crowds packed the courtroom like spectators at a theater, eager to witness the man who'd killed Alexander Hamilton, now fighting for his life against charges of empire building. The prosecution's case hinged on General James Wilkinson, the gloriously unreliable commander of the U.S. Army who'd mysteriously delayed reporting Burr's plot while allegedly editing key evidence to protect himself. His dramatic testimony unraveled almost immediately. Marshall caught him in contradictions, and the defense exposed his long-hidden role as a paid Spanish spy. It was like watching the star witness impeach himself in real time, but the real bombshell came when Marshall interpreted the Constitution's treason clause with surgical precision. The framers, wary of royal abuse, had defined treason narrowly, only levying war against the U.S. or giving aid and comfort to enemies. Burr's wild scheming in the Ohio Valley might have been reckless, but without an actual army marching under his flag, Marshall ruled it wasn't treason, just talk. Jefferson fumed, calling the decision a mockery of law, but the precedent stuck. For the first time, the judiciary had checked a president's overreach, establishing that not every conspiracy met the Constitution's high bar for treason. Burr walked free, though his political career was corpse by then. The trial's legacy outlived both men, becoming a touchstone for every future treason case, from Confederate sympathizers to 20th-century spies. It cemented a crucial American principle. Even in moments of national panic, the definition of treason couldn't stretch to fit the fears of the powerful. Yet Burr's acquittal came with a haunting footnote. Though legally innocent, he'd undeniably flirted with rebellion, proving how easily ambition could blur into sedition in a young nation still stitching itself together. His conspiracy, real or imagined, exposed the fragility of the Union, where loyalty was negotiable and borders fluid. 2 centuries later, as we debate what constitutes treason in an age of cyber warfare and insurrections, Marshall's strict standard remains both a shield and a provocation. How much betrayal is too much before the law can act? And when does punishing treachery risk becoming its own kind of tyranny? The Burr trial left those questions dangling like a sword over democracy itself. Few political deals have been mocked as relentlessly as Secretary of State William Seward's purchase of Alaska in 1867. Newspapers roasted him for spending $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents an acre, on what they called Seward's icebox, a frozen wasteland useless to anyone except polar bears. Critics branded it the worst real estate blunder since the Dutch bought Manhattan for beads, with one congressman joking that America should annex the North Pole next to complete its collection of useless ice. The backlash was so fierce that for decades, Seward's folly became shorthand for government waste, but beneath the ridicule lay a far more strategic gamble. Seward, a visionary expansionist, had spent years pushing to stretch America's borders beyond the continental mainland. He saw what others couldn't, that controlling Alaska would give the U.S. dominance over Pacific trade routes and check Russian and British ambitions in the region. The timing was perfect. Russia, still reeling from the Crimean War, was desperate to offload the remote territory before Britain might seize it. Yet when the treaty reached Congress, lawmakers balked. Some questioned whether the Constitution even allowed buying foreign land. Others scoffed at funding a polar bear garden when Reconstruction debts were crippling the South. The debate dragged on for months until President Andrew Johnson's administration finally strong-armed approval through. The real scandal wasn't the purchase, it was the tidal wave of corruption that followed. Almost immediately, rumors swirled that Russian diplomats had secretly bribed key congressmen to approve the deal. Investigations uncovered that over $100,000, a fortune at the time, had mysteriously vanished into private pockets during negotiations. A naval officer sent to survey Alaska's coastline was caught embezzling funds meant for supplies, while opportunistic contractors inflated prices for everything from sled dogs to canned meat. The stench of graft grew so thick that one reformer declared Alaska a refrigerator for taxpayer dollars. Then came the twist no one saw coming. In 1896, prospectors struck gold in the Klondike, turning Seward's so-called folly into an economic juggernaut. The rush flooded Alaska with miners, yielding over $100 million in gold within a decade, more than 10 times the purchase price. Later discoveries of oil, timber, and strategic minerals would make the territory one of America's greatest bargains. The same critics who'd lampooned Seward now scrambled to rewrite history, pretending they'd supported the deal all along. Alaska's redemption arc exposed a deeper truth about political scandal. Sometimes the loudest outrage ages the worst. What seemed like reckless spending in 1867 became visionary strategy by 1900. The graft surrounding the deal was real, but Seward's critics had missed the forest for the snow-covered trees. History's verdict, the greatest irony of all, might be that America's last frontier began as a national joke and ended up proving that even the most mocked decisions can thaw into brilliance. The newspapers of 1867 didn't just criticize Seward's Alaska purchase, they turned it into a national punchline. Editorial cartoons depicted polar bears signing real estate contracts, while headlines sneered at Johnson's polar bear garden and Walrussia. The New York Tribune called it a frozen wilderness of despair, and Harper's Weekly joked that the only inhabitants were icebergs and Esquimaux. This wasn't just reporting, it was a full-blown media frenzy, with papers competing to outdo each other's ridicule. The backlash was so intense that for years politicians avoided mentioning Alaska altogether, fearing career suicide by association. But the press wasn't just reflecting public opinion, it was shaping it. Before the purchase, most Americans knew nothing about Alaska's strategic value or natural resources. Journalists, relying on outdated maps and Russian exaggerations, painted it as a barren icebox devoid of value. Rare were voices like that of Charles Sumner, the Senate Foreign Relations Chair, who gave a 3-hour speech detailing Alaska's potential only to have his arguments drowned out by louder, snarkier headlines. The media's power to amplify scorn became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more Alaska was mocked, the harder it became for anyone to defend it without becoming a target themselves. The irony, of course, is how spectacularly history proved these critics wrong. When gold was discovered in the Klondike 3 decades later, the same newspapers that had ridiculed Seward suddenly pivoted to breathless coverage of Alaska's untapped riches. The New York Times, which once called the purchase a dark deed done in the night, now ran stories praising Seward's foresight. Cartoons depicting shivering bureaucrats gave way to illustrations of prospectors striking it rich. It was a masterclass in selective memory outrage sells, but redemption rarely makes headlines. This cycle feels eerily familiar today. Modern media still thrives on knee-jerk reactions to political decisions, from stimulus packages to climate policies. The same outlets that mock wasteful spending on speculative projects often quietly backtrack when those investments pay off, assuming anyone's still paying attention by then. The Alaska saga reminds us that outrage is cheap, but vision is priceless. And while it's easy to laugh at Seward's folly now, how many of today's mocked policies might be tomorrow's triumphs? The real scandal wasn't the purchase, it was how quickly the narrative flipped once money started talking louder than pride. The Iran-Contra affair wasn't just a scandal, it was a Rube Goldberg machine of illegal arms deals, secret Swiss bank accounts, and ideological gymnastics that left even seasoned Washington insiders baffled. Picture this: the Reagan administration publicly vowing never to negotiate with terrorists, quietly authorizing weapons sales to Iran. The same regime holding Americans hostage in Lebanon, all while funneling the profits to Nicaraguan rebels Congress had explicitly banned funding. It was like watching someone juggle chainsaws while insisting they were baking a cake. At the heart of this madness lay 2 contradictory policies colliding in spectacular fashion. On one hand, Reagan's team was desperate to free U.S. hostages in the Middle East. On the other, they were hellbent on overthrowing Nicaragua's socialist government by funding the Contra rebels, despite Congress passing the Boland amendments to block such interference. The solution, a convoluted scheme where arms dealers acted as middlemen, marking up missile prices to skim profits for the Contras, while White House staffers shredded documents and joked about plausible deniability. The sheer audacity of the operation was matched only by its sloppiness. When a cargo plane ferrying guns to the Contras was shot down over Nicaragua, the surviving crew member, Eugene Hasenfuss, spilled everything to Sandinista forces, including how the operation traced back to the CIA. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Hezbollah militants started showing off brand new American TOW missiles on TV, blowing the administration's cover story to smithereens. The unraveling reached its peak when Attorney General Edwin Meese discovered a memo in Lt. Col. Oliver North's office detailing the diversion of funds, written like a shopping list for treason. What makes Iran-Contra so surreal isn't just the law-breaking, it's the moral contortions used to justify it. Officials like North testified before Congress with the fervor of revolutionaries, arguing that lying to legislators was patriotism if it thwarted communism. Reagan himself delivered a nationally televised address calling the arms sales a mistake, but never admitted authorizing the Contra funding, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The fallout saw 11 convictions, including North's, later overturned on a technicality, but the real legacy was the precedent it set. That national security could be a magic wand to wave away checks and balances. In the end, the scandal exposed a chilling truth that some in power believed their crusade against communism placed them above the law. The same administration that lectured about trust but verify with the Soviets had built a shadow government trading missiles for hostages and democracy for dogma. Iran-Contra wasn't just a policy failure, it was a stress test for American democracy, and for a terrifying moment the system blinked. Ollie North didn't just testify before Congress, he turned the Iran-Contra hearings into a one-man political theater. Dressed in his Marine uniform, ribbons gleaming, he delivered a performance so defiant it straddled the line between testimony and rally speech. When grilled about illegal arms deals and shredded documents, North didn't shrink. He leaned in, framing every lie as an act of patriotism. "I'm not here to accept culpability," he declared, his voice steady. "I was given a mission and I carried it out to the best of my ability." The bombast was calculated. By painting himself as a soldier following orders to fight communism, he flipped the script. Suddenly, the man who'd helped run a shadow war wasn't a criminal, he was a patriot under siege by bureaucrats. The effect was electric. Conservative audiences ate it up. Here was a decorated veteran shot in Vietnam, now being lectured by lawmakers who'd never seen combat. His folksy charm calling senators "sir," while subtly undermining them, played perfectly on camera. When shown evidence of his own memos authorizing fund diversions, North didn't flinch. "I was told to make it happen," he shrugged, implying higher-ups had blessed the operation. The subtext was clear. If this was treason, why were Reagan and his inner circle still untouched? North's testimony exposed a cultural fault line in America. To his critics, he embodied lawless militarism, a man who treated Congress as an obstacle rather than a co-equal branch. But to his supporters, he was a hero, a real-life Jack Bauer, sacrificing himself to protect the country from both terrorists and weak-kneed politicians. Polls showed a staggering 60% of Republicans approved of his actions. Overnight, North became a conservative icon, his face plastered on fundraising mailers and talk show circuits. The irony was thick enough to choke on. A man admitting to felonies in open court was being celebrated as a martyr. Behind the bravado, though, North's strategy was legally perilous. By admitting to lies and document destruction, even while justifying them, he all but gift-wrapped his own conviction. Yet the spectacle worked in one crucial way: it shifted the narrative. Suddenly, the scandal wasn't about constitutional violations. It was about whether real Americans trusted soldiers or politicians. By the time North was sentenced only to have it overturned on a technicality, the damage was done. He'd rewritten the playbook for political scandals. When caught, go on offense, wrap yourself in the flag, and let the backlash shield you. Decades later, his play would be borrowed by everyone from Wall Street fraudsters to January 6 defendants' proof that in America, performance can sometimes outweigh the facts. The real tragedy of North's star turn wasn't just the laws broken. It was how effectively he revealed the limits of accountability. His testimony didn't just defend his actions, it weaponized the very ideals he'd violated, turning oversight into persecution. When history handed him a chance to reckon with his choices, North chose theater over truth, and a startling number of Americans gave him a standing ovation. The Chappaquiddick incident was supposed to be the end of Ted Kennedy's political career, a single night of bad decisions that spiraled into tragedy and disgrace. Instead, it became a macabre case study in how power, privilege, and sheer political will can bend the arc of accountability. On the humid evening of July 18, 1969, Kennedy left a party on Chappaquiddick Island with 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopchen, a former aide to his late brother Robert. What happened next remains shrouded in contradictions. Kennedy's car plunged off a narrow wooden bridge into a tidal channel, landing upside down in the water. While Kennedy somehow escaped, Kopchen drowned, trapped inside the submerged vehicle. What followed wasn't just a tragedy, it was a masterclass in damage control. Kennedy didn't report the accident to police for nearly 10 hours, a delay he later blamed on a confused concussion. By the time authorities arrived, the tide had shifted the car, muddying forensic evidence. Witnesses reported seeing Kennedy walking calmly back to his hotel that night, dry and seemingly unharmed, while Kopchen fought for air in the darkness. The autopsy later suggested she might have survived for hours, meaning a prompt call for help could have saved her. Instead, Kennedy consulted family lawyers before notifying police, a sequence that reeked of calculation, not confusion. The cover-up theories multiplied like wildfire. Some speculated Kennedy was drunk, others that he and Kopchen were having an affair, both scenarios that would have been political dynamite for the last surviving Kennedy brother. The grand jury was barred from indicting him for manslaughter, and he pled guilty only to leaving the scene, receiving a suspended 2-month sentence. His televised explanation, where he asked voters whether he should resign, was a masterpiece of deflection, framing the incident as a personal moral dilemma rather than a criminal act. He leaned on the Kennedy mystique, invoking his family's tragedies to evoke sympathy. It worked. Though his presidential ambitions were crippled, Massachusetts voters returned him to the Senate again and again, as if the stain of Chappaquiddick could be rinsed away by time and loyalty. The scandal's legacy isn't just about one man's survival, it's about the machinery of power that made it possible. While ordinary citizens would have faced manslaughter charges, Kennedy's name bought him legal deference and a staggering lack of curiosity from authorities. The press, too, treaded lightly, a stark contrast to today's relentless scrutiny. Chappaquiddick became a grim benchmark in political culture, proving that for some, the rules are merely suggestions. And though Kennedy would later rebuild his reputation as a lion of the Senate, the question lingers: how many second chances does privilege grant, and who pays the price for them? The bridge at Chappaquiddick still stands today, a silent monument to the night America learned some tragedies are negotiable if you know the right people. Chappaquiddick didn't just derail Ted Kennedy's career, it became the darkest chapter in the so-called Kennedy curse, a narrative that had haunted the family for decades. The tragedy unfolded just weeks after the moon landing, when America was still basking in the glory of Camelot's promise. Instead of celebrating new frontiers, the nation watched as the last Kennedy brother stood at a press podium, his voice trembling, begging voters to decide whether he deserved to stay in office. The irony was brutal. The family that had embodied youthful idealism was now synonymous with reckless tragedy, their legacy rewritten overnight from hope to hubris. The curse framing wasn't new: JFK's assassination, Bobby's murder, Joe Jr.'s wartime death, each had been woven into a tapestry of fatalism, but Chappaquiddick felt different. This wasn't an external force striking the Kennedys down. It was self-inflicted, a shadow cast by their own choices. Tabloids ran side-by-side photos, Jack's inauguration grin next to Ted's dazed mugshot, Bobby's soaring rhetoric contrasted with Ted's halting confession. The contrast was devastating. Where earlier tragedies had elevated the Kennedys to near sainthood, this one reduced Ted to a cautionary tale, a man who'd failed the myth. Political analysts predicted the end. No senator could survive leaving a woman to drown while he consulted lawyers. Yet Ted's career didn't collapse, it mutated. The same scandal that killed his 1980 presidential bid, Democrats privately called him unelectable, strangely cemented his Senate legacy. Stripped of White House ambitions, he became a legislative workhorse, channeling his energy into healthcare and education bills. Some saw it as penance, others pragmatism. The man who might have been president settled into a different role, the liberal lion whose very survival became proof that even the damned could redeem themselves, or at least outlast the headlines. But the cursed narrative refused to die. For decades, every Kennedy stumble, from William Kennedy Smith's rape trial to Patrick Kennedy's addiction struggles, was framed as another installment in the family's tragic saga. Ted's later years, marked by his fierce advocacy for Obamacare, were often overshadowed by whispers of what might have been. The tragedy of Chappaquiddick wasn't just the life lost, it was the way it crystallized the Kennedys as America's tragic royalty, forever balancing brilliance with recklessness. Even in redemption, Ted could never escape the shadow of that bridge, or the question it left hanging. Was the curse real, or had the family's own myth-making trapped them in a cycle they couldn't break? The answer, perhaps, lies in the duality of the Kennedy legacy. For every moment of grace, Ted's eulogy for Bobby, his endorsement of Obama, there was a reminder of the price paid. The family that gave America its first Catholic president also gave it Chappaquiddick, a scandal that refused to fade. In the end, the curse wasn't magic. It was the weight of expectation, the glare of scrutiny, and the cruel math of history where one night of poor judgment could outweigh a lifetime of service. Ted Kennedy lived long enough to become the patriarch, but he never stopped being the man who drove away while Mary Jo Kopchen couldn't. And that, more than any curse, was the burden he carried to the grave. The Abscam sting operation wasn't just an FBI investigation. It was a Hollywood-worthy spectacle of greed, bad wigs, and politicians so gullible they could have starred in their own slapstick comedy. The year was 1980, and the FBI, frustrated by rampant corruption in Washington, decided to flip the script. Instead of chasing leads, they'd dangle bait so irresistible even the slickest politicians wouldn't see the trap. Enter Abdul Enterprises, a fake company fronted by undercover agents posing as wealthy Arab sheikhs, complete with flowing robes, thick accents, and briefcases stuffed with more cash than most Americans earned in a decade. Their pitch: cold, hard bribes in exchange for political favors. And the shocking part wasn't that politicians took the money, but how eagerly they grabbed it. The operation's centerpiece was a series of secretly recorded meetings so brazen they defied belief. One congressman, Representative Michael Myers of Pennsylvania, didn't just accept a $50,000 bribe. He negotiated for more, complaining, "Money talks in this business and bullshit walks." Another, Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, promised to fast-track mining permits for the sheikhs, boasting he could move mountains in exchange for a cut of the profits. The tapes captured every damning word, from counting stacks of bills in hotel rooms to clinking champagne glasses over crooked deals. The FBI even filmed one politician stuffing cash into his jacket pockets like a Black Friday shopper, utterly unaware the whole scene was being preserved for his eventual indictment. What made Abscam so extraordinary wasn't just the corruption, it was the sheer theatricality of the sting. Agents rented luxury suites on yachts and in five-star hotels, laying out buffets of Middle Eastern cuisine to sell the illusion. They scripted elaborate backstories for their fake sheikhs, complete with fictional oil empires and nephews studying at American universities. The politicians, blinded by dollar signs, ignored every red flag. Never mind that the sheikhs barely knew basic Arabic or that their business proposals made no financial sense. When greed takes the wheel, critical thinking hops in the trunk. The fallout was catastrophic for the 7 members of Congress caught in the net. Trials aired the tapes for a horrified public, showing elected officials haggling over bribes like merchants at a flea market. Myers was expelled from the House, the first member kicked out since the Civil War. Williams resigned from the Senate before his colleagues could oust him. Yet for all its success, Abscam sparked fierce debate. Critics accused the FBI of entrapment, arguing they'd created crimes that might never have happened otherwise. Defenders shot back. The politicians weren't lured, they leaped. The operation didn't manufacture corruption. It exposed a rot that was already there. In the end, Abscam became more than a scandal. It was a cultural wake-up call. The sight of politicians pawing at cash on grainy FBI footage shattered any lingering myths about Washington's moral high ground. It inspired everything from congressional ethics reforms to a wave of cynical political thrillers, proving truth really was stranger than fiction. And it left one enduring question: if this was the corruption they caught, what deals were slipping through the cracks? The sheikhs may have been fake, but the hunger for easy money was painfully real. Perhaps the most telling detail came years later, when one of the convicted lawmakers, unrepentant to the end, shrugged off his crimes by quipping, "Everyone does it, I just got caught." That casual cynicism was Abscam's real legacy. Not just the crimes themselves, but the blasé attitude that treated corruption as just another day at the office. The FBI's tapes didn't just catch crooks, they held up a mirror to a system where power had become a commodity and ethics were negotiable. And for a brief, surreal moment in 1980, America got to watch the sausage-making process of politics in all its greasy, unappetizing glory. Abscam's fallout didn't just land politicians in prison, it sent shockwaves through Washington's entire culture of backroom deals. The grainy footage of lawmakers stuffing bribes into their pockets was so damning that Congress had no choice but to act, passing the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 and tightening financial disclosure rules. Suddenly, officials had to report their investments, gifts, and even hotel stays, dragging shadows into the light. But the reforms came with a bitter irony. The same sting operation that exposed corruption also sparked furious debates over whether the FBI had crossed the line from investigation into outright entrapment. Defenders of Abscam argued the politicians weren't coerced. They were caught red-handed, their greed on full display. The undercover agents hadn't dangled impossible offers. They'd simply presented opportunities and the lawmakers lunged. You don't need to twist arms when the doors are already wide open, one prosecutor famously quipped, yet critics, including some federal judges, saw a dangerous precedent. The FBI had invented fictional sheikhs, fabricated business deals, and aggressively pushed cash into conversations. Did that create crimes that otherwise wouldn't exist? The line between exposing corruption and manufacturing it seemed perilously thin. The legal aftermath only deepened the divide. While convictions piled up, appeals courts grappled with thorny questions. When does a sting stop being a trap and start being theater? One appellate judge compared Abscam to testing firefighters by arson, arguing that when the government provides both the temptation and the means, it risks becoming the architect of the very crimes it condemns. The Supreme Court eventually upheld the convictions, but the skepticism lingered, shaping future undercover operations. Meanwhile, the political class learned the wrong lesson. Instead of cleaning house, many in Washington simply got savvier. The era of suitcases full of cash gave way to subtler schemes, lobbyist-funded, fact-finding trips to tropical resorts, cushy consulting gigs for retiring lawmakers, and corporate boards stocked with ex-politicians. Abscam didn't end corruption, it just taught the corrupt to speak in winks and nods rather than on FBI tapes. The scandal's deepest legacy lies in the paradox it exposed. Reforms can force transparency, but they can't legislate ethics. Stings can catch the blatantly greedy, but they can't touch the quietly connected. And while the public cheered as Abscam's villains faced justice, the system itself proved staggeringly resilient. 40 years later, the same questions haunt every corruption scandal. Are we punishing crimes or just the criminals clumsy enough to get caught? And in a town where power and money swirl together like whiskey in a glass, is any law strong enough to keep them apart? The tapes may have stopped rolling, but the dance goes on. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal wasn't just a sex story. It was a seismic collision of power, privacy, and partisan warfare that turned a president's private failings into a national referendum on truth itself. The saga began quietly in 1995 when 22-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky struck up an intimate relationship with Bill Clinton, then the most powerful man in the world. What might have remained a secret affair became historic when Lewinsky confided in co-worker Linda Tripp, who, armed with a tape recorder and a vendetta, transformed gossip into a legal grenade. By 1998, the scandal exploded into public view, forcing Clinton to utter the most infamous denial in presidential history. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." The absurdity reached peak surrealism when prosecutors revealed they had physical evidence, a blue dress from the Gap, preserved by Lewinsky, bearing DNA that matched the president's. The image of FBI technicians analyzing a stained garment for seminal fluid turned the Oval Office into a crime scene, reducing high-stakes politics to tabloid fodder. Clinton's legalistic dodging, quibbling over the definition of sexual relations like a teenager passing curfew rules, only deepened the farce. His grand jury testimony, where he admitted to inappropriate intimate contact while insisting it wasn't technically sex, became a masterclass in hair-splitting that left America simultaneously riveted and repulsed. But the real scandal wasn't the affair, it was the impeachment circus that followed. Republicans, led by Special Prosecutor Ken Starr, seized on Clinton's lies under oath to charge him with perjury and obstruction of justice. The House voted to impeach, marking only the second time in history a president faced removal by the Senate. Yet the spectacle backfired spectacularly. Democrats framed the ordeal as a partisan witch hunt over private misconduct, while polls showed most Americans disapproved of Clinton's behavior but saw impeachment as overreach. The Senate ultimately acquitted him, but the damage was done. The office of the presidency had been dragged through the mud, and the line between public service and peep show vanished. What makes this scandal endure isn't just the tawdry details, it's how perfectly it captured the changing norms of the media age. The internet, then in its infancy, turned rumor into wildfire overnight. Late-night hosts mined the scandal for endless punchlines, while serious journalists debated whether oral sex constituted high crimes and misdemeanors. Clinton's approval rating stayed bizarrely high throughout, suggesting voters had compartmentalized his personal and professional conduct, a harbinger of today's polarized politics where partisan loyalty often outweighs moral outrage. The dress itself became the ultimate metaphor, a stain that couldn't be washed out no matter how much spin was applied. Decades later, the scandal remains a Rorschach test. Was it about holding power accountable or prurient political theater? Did it expose a predator or persecute a president for consensual indiscretions? The answers depend on who you ask, but one thing's certain: no future scandal would ever blur the lines between public and private quite like this one. In the end, Clinton survived, Lewinsky rebuilt her life, and America got a crash course in the messy intersection of sex, power, and the limits of presidential accountability. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal didn't just dominate headlines, it rewrote the rulebook for how the media covers political disgrace. For the first time, 24-hour cable news and the fledgling internet collided to create a feedback loop of gossip, speculation, and partisan warfare, turning a private affair into a public spectacle with no off-ramp. CNN's wall-to-wall coverage set the template: breathless tickers, split-screen debates, and expert panels dissecting everything from dress fibers to the semantics of presidential apologies. Meanwhile, fledgling websites like the Drudge Report bypassed traditional gatekeepers, breaking the story before print journalists could fact-check it. The scandal didn't just unfold, it metastasized in real time, with every smirk, denial, and legal filing amplified into a national event. What made this media frenzy unprecedented wasn't just the volume, it was the collapse of boundaries between news and entertainment. Late-night hosts like Jay Leno and David Letterman turned impeachment hearings into punchlines, while Saturday Night Live sketches featuring a cigar-waving Clinton impersonator seeped into the collective consciousness. Even highbrow outlets couldn't resist the gravitational pull. The New Yorker published cartoons of intern-themed Oval Office decor, and Time magazine's stayed cover asked, "The President and the Intern, how wrong was it?" In a tone that felt more like a morality play than journalism, the scandal's salacious details became a cultural Rorschach test, revealing less about Clinton's behavior than about America's appetite for schadenfreude. The internet's role was equally transformative. Message boards and early social platforms like AOL chatrooms became battlegrounds where users debated everything from legal definitions to feminist critiques of power dynamics. For the first time, ordinary citizens could bypass editorial filters and weigh in, often viciously, on a president's sex life. Lewinsky's name was memed before memes had a name, her image plastered across crude GeoCities pages alongside jokes about cigars and stained dresses. The sheer velocity of rumor outpaced fact-checking, creating an ecosystem where speculation hardened into truth before journalists could verify a single source. This shift had lasting consequences. The scandal normalized the idea that private misconduct was fair game for public dissection, eroding the line between personal and political. It also birthed the modern outrage economy, where ratings and clicks rewarded sensationalism over substance. Networks learned that scandals didn't need policy implications to captivate audiences. They just needed humiliation, denial, and a hint of tabloid voyeurism. By the time Clinton left office, the media landscape had calcified into its current form. A churn of amplification, hot takes, and partisan framing where the stakes of every scandal are measured less by legal merit than by their potential to go viral. Perhaps the most ironic legacy of the media circus was its unintended democratization. For all its prurience, the coverage forced conversations about power imbalances, consent, and workplace ethics into mainstream discourse. Feminist scholars sparred on cable news about whether Lewinsky was a victim or a willing participant. Legal analysts debated whether lying about sex warranted impeachment. Even comedians like Chris Rock reframed the debate, joking, "The president didn't drop bombs, he dropped lollipops on interns." The scandal's cultural aftershocks reverberated far beyond Washington, influencing everything from workplace harassment policies to the way future generations would view authority figures caught in similar binds. In the end, the media didn't just cover the scandal, it became a co-conspirator, shaping narratives as much as reporting them. The same outlets that once treated presidential affairs with dignified silence now dissected them like reality TV plotlines. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear: the rules of engagement had changed forever. From that moment on, no scandal would ever be private, no denial unchallenged, and no stain, literal or metaphorical, left unexamined under the relentless glare of the digital age. The Clinton-Lewinsky saga wasn't just a story about power and betrayal. It was the moment America realized the media could turn even the most personal failings into a national bloodsport, and that the audience would always come back for more. Anthony Weiner's sexting scandal wasn't just a political embarrassment, it was a slow-motion train wreck of self-sabotage so relentless it veered into Shakespearean tragedy. The New York congressman, once a rising Democratic star with a fiery populist streak, saw his career implode not once, not twice, but 3 separate times over nearly identical scandals, each more ludicrous than the last. It started in 2011 when Weiner accidentally tweeted a bulging brief-clad photo meant as a private message to a college student. His initial denial, claiming his account had been hacked, collapsed within days under a barrage of evidence, including shirtless gym selfies and flirty exchanges with multiple women. The press conference where he finally admitted fault was a masterpiece of cringe. Sweat-drenched and trembling, he apologized while his bewildered wife, a top aide to Hillary Clinton, stood stiffly beside him like a hostage. Yet what made Weiner's saga unforgettable wasn't the initial fall, it was the breathtaking lack of impulse control that followed. After resigning in disgrace, he staged a comeback bid for New York City mayor in 2013, only to have another sexting scandal surface mid-campaign. This time, the leaked messages revealed he'd been using the alias Carlos Danger, a pseudonym so laughably melodramatic it sounded like a rejected Bond villain. The texts were even more explicit, including one where he joked about enacting a Weiner pardon if elected. The sheer audacity of it all, a man torpedoing his redemption arc with the same reckless behavior, left pundits and voters alike slack-jawed. But the universe hadn't finished humiliating Weiner yet. In 2016, while separated from his wife amid yet another sexting exposé, he was caught exchanging sexually charged messages with a 15-year-old girl, a line even his most jaded critics never saw him crossing. The FBI seized his laptop during the investigation, inadvertently uncovering classified emails from his wife's State Department account, a twist that entangled Weiner in the Clinton email scandal and arguably shifted media focus during the final weeks of the 2016 presidential election. The irony was almost poetic. A man whose name had become shorthand for self-destructive horniness, now playing an accidental role in one of the most consequential elections in modern history. What sets Weiner's story apart from other political sex scandals isn't the tawdriness, it's the psychological puzzle. Here was a Harvard-educated legislator with a knack for economic policy, whose addiction to attention, digital or otherwise, overrode every survival instinct. His behavior wasn't just reckless, it felt compulsive, like watching someone repeatedly punch themselves in the face while insisting they'd learned their lesson. The Freudian undertones were impossible to ignore. A man literally named Weiner, whose career was destroyed by his inability to keep his, let's say, enthusiasm offline. The fallout was as brutal as it was predictable. Weiner pleaded guilty to transferring obscene material to a minor and spent 21 months in federal prison. His wife filed for divorce, his political allies disowned him, and late-night comedians feasted on his carcass for years. Yet the scandal's real legacy was how it exposed the gap between public persona and private compulsion. Weiner wasn't some backroom schemer or ideological fanatic. He was a cautionary tale about the seductive danger of digital validation, a man who couldn't resist the dopamine hit of a stranger's attention, even at the cost of everything he'd built. In the end, his story wasn't just about sexting. It was about the lies we tell ourselves, the addictions we rationalize, and the terrifying ease with which a single send button can vaporize a lifetime of achievements. And for all its absurdity, that's a lesson far too many still haven't learned. Huma Abedin wasn't just Anthony Weiner's long-suffering wife. She was the connective tissue that turned his personal implosion into a geopolitical crisis. As Hillary Clinton's closest aide for over 2 decades, Abedin had been privy to State Department secrets, campaign strategies, and the innermost workings of one of the most scrutinized political machines in modern history. So when the FBI seized Weiner's laptop in 2016 during their investigation into his sexting with a minor, they stumbled upon something far bigger than lewd messages, a trove of Clinton's classified emails from a private server forwarded to Abedin's account. The timing couldn't have been more catastrophic. With just 11 days left before the 2016 election, FBI Director James Comey reopened the Clinton email investigation, citing the newly discovered messages, a decision that polling suggests may have tipped the razor-thin race to Donald Trump. The irony was almost too brutal to comprehend. A scandal that began with a congressman's reckless tweets now threatened the presidency itself, all because of a digital paper trail linking Weiner's self-destruction to Clinton's biggest liability. Critics pounced, framing the emails as proof of a rigged system, where elite insiders like Abedin skirted security protocols. Never mind that investigators ultimately found no new evidence of wrongdoing. The damage was in the headlines, not the findings. Trump rallies erupted with chants of "lock her up," while Clinton's team scrambled to contain a narrative they'd spent years trying to bury. The spectacle laid bare a painful truth. In politics, guilt by association isn't just a tactic, it's an inevitability. What made Abedin's position uniquely tragic was the duality of her role. She wasn't just a political operative caught in the crossfire. She was a woman whose professional loyalty had become indistinguishable from her personal life. For years, she'd weathered whispers about her marriage, standing by Weiner through multiple humiliations. Now, her devotion to both Clinton and her husband placed her at the center of twin storms, one involving national security, the other a tabloid circus. The press dissected her every move. Was she an enabler, a victim, or, as some conservative outlets darkly implied, a co-conspirator in Clinton's email practices? The scrutiny became so intense that even her fashion choices, like a post-scandal Vogue photoshoot, were passed for hidden messages. The fallout exposed how easily personal and political failures could intertwine at the highest levels. Weiner's recklessness didn't just destroy his own career, it amplified suspicions about Clinton's inner circle, reinforcing a narrative of elitist carelessness. And while Abedin herself was never accused of illegal activity, her proximity to both scandals made her a lightning rod for larger cultural anxieties about power, privacy, and the messy intersection of private lives and public trust. In the end, the episode became a case study in collateral damage. Weiner's addiction to attention didn't just cost him his family and freedom, it sent shockwaves through an election that would redefine American politics. And Abedin, once the epitome of discretion, found her name etched into history not for her decades of public service, but as a footnote in one of the most improbable chain reactions in political history. The lesson: in Washington, no scandal exists in isolation, especially when the players are this deeply connected. The same networks that elevate careers can also become conduits for catastrophe, leaving even the most careful operators vulnerable to the chaos of others. The Watergate break-in wasn't just a burglary, it was the moment American politics lost its innocence. On June 17, 1972, 5 men in business suits were caught rifling through files at the Democratic National Committee headquarters inside Washington's Watergate complex. At first glance, it seemed like a clumsy crime. One of the intruders had tape over door locks to prevent them from latching, while another carried a pen-sized can of mace and a stack of sequentially numbered $100 bills. But what made the incident extraordinary wasn't the bungled execution, it was the trail of evidence leading straight to the Oval Office. Within days, reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post uncovered connections between the burglars and President Nixon's re-election committee. The men had ties to the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and a shadowy White House plumbers unit tasked with plugging leaks. As the scandal deepened, Nixon's team swung into damage control, handing out hush money and pressuring the FBI to back off. The president himself dismissed the affair as a third-rate burglary, but behind the scenes he was orchestrating a cover-up so vast it would eventually consume his presidency. The smoking gun came in the form of a secret tape recording. Nixon had installed a voice-activated system to document all Oval Office conversations, never imagining the recordings would become his undoing. When subpoenaed, he refused to hand them over, claiming executive privilege until the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him. The tapes revealed Nixon casually discussing payoffs and conspiring to obstruct justice, including one infamous moment where he ordered the CIA to shut down the FBI's investigation, snarling, "I don't give a damn what the law says." The sheer banality of the corruption was staggering. The most powerful man in the world caught on tape plotting like a two-bit mob boss. Watergate's fallout redefined political accountability. Facing near-certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the only U.S. president ever to do so. Over 40 administration officials were indicted or jailed, including his Attorney General and Chief of Staff. Congress passed sweeping reforms, from campaign finance laws to the War Powers Act, aiming to prevent future abuses. Yet the scandal's true legacy was psychological. For the first time, a majority of Americans questioned whether their leaders could be trusted at all. The cynical phrase, "follow the money," entered the lexicon, and journalism gained a new heroic archetype, the dogged reporter holding power to account. What makes Watergate endure isn't just the crime, it's the blueprint it left behind. Every political scandal since has been measured against it, from Iran-Contra to Russiagate. The tapes taught us that power, unchecked, breeds entitlement, that the cover-up often proves worse than the crime. And in a twist Nixon himself might have appreciated, his paranoid instinct to record everything birthed an era of unprecedented transparency. one where politicians now assume every word might one day be leaked, tweeted, or subpoenaed. Watergate didn't just topple a president, it shattered the myth that those in charge always play by the rules, leaving a nation forever wary of what happens behind closed doors. For decades, Deep Throat wasn't just a nickname, it was a mystery that haunted Washington. The shadowy figure who'd guided Woodward and Bernstein through the labyrinth of Watergate, feeding them crucial leads from deep inside the FBI, remained an enigma wrapped in speculation. Conspiracy theories swirled like smoke in a locked room. Was Deep Throat a disillusioned CIA operative, a high-ranking White House official playing both sides? Even Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, floated the idea that it might be a composite of multiple sources, a narrative sleight of hand to protect identities. The truth, when it finally came in 2005, was almost anticlimactic. Mark Felt, the FBI's former associate director, had been the man in the shadows all along. What makes Felt's revelation so fascinating isn't just the weight, it's the moral ambiguity that surrounded him. Here was a man who'd broken protocol, leaking classified information to journalists while serving as the FBI's second-in-command. His motives were murky. Some claimed he was a whistleblower, outraged by Nixon's attempts to obstruct the Bureau's investigation. Others suspected personal pique. Felt had been passed over for director after J. Edgar Hoover's death and resented being sidelined. The most tantalizing theory, he was playing a long game, using the press to force the Justice Department's hand after Attorney General John Mitchell, a Nixon loyalist, stonewalled the FBI at every turn. Whatever his reasons, Felt's clandestine meetings with Woodward in parking garages, whispering clues under flickering fluorescent lights, became the stuff of journalistic legend. Yet the delay in exposing Felt's identity had unintended consequences. For 30 years, the Deep Throat mythos grew unchecked, morphing into a Rorschach test for how America viewed power. Conspiracy theorists latched onto the secrecy, insisting the real Deep Throat was someone even more explosive, maybe even Nixon himself, sabotaging his own presidency in some twisted act of self-destruction. Hollywood immortalized the mystery in All the President's Men, with Hal Holbrook's smoky, anonymous portrayal leaving audiences to wonder. The longer Felt stayed silent, the more the speculation calcified into alternate histories, proving how easily facts blur when shadows linger too long. Felt's eventual confession, coaxed out by his family as dementia set in, didn't just solve a puzzle, it rewrote his legacy. Overnight, he went from a retired bureaucrat living quietly in California to a polarizing figure. Some hailed him as a hero who'd sacrificed career ambitions to expose corruption. Others branded him a traitor who'd undermined law enforcement protocols. The debate crystallized a fundamental tension. Is leaking ever justified when the system fails? And does anonymity, that crucial shield protecting sources, make the truth more powerful or just more enigmatic? The strangest twist came after Felt's death in 2008. As historians sifted through newly released files, they uncovered evidence that Hoover's FBI had routinely spied on politicians and activists, blurring the line between investigation and intimidation. Suddenly, Felt's actions looked different, not just a rebellion against Nixon, but part of a deeper institutional rot. The man who'd helped topple a president had also been a cog in Hoover's surveillance machine, complicating his hero's narrative. Watergate taught us that power corrupts, but Deep Throat's saga taught us something subtler, that even truth-tellers are flawed, their motives as layered as the systems they challenge. The mystery wasn't just about who he was, it was about why we needed him to be a myth for so long. In the end, Felt's greatest revelation might have been this: real-life whistleblowers don't emerge from the shadows as pristine saviors. They step forward hesitantly, carrying the weight of their own contradictions, and we're left to decide whether the truth they unveil is worth the secrets they keep. From Teapot Dome's satchels of cash to Anthony Weiner's self-destructive tweets, American political scandals have proven one universal truth: The second you think you've seen it all, power finds a way to outdo itself. These stories aren't just about corruption, they're about the deliciously human collision of ambition and absurdity, where ego trips over its own shoelaces and lands face first in front of the whole country. Whether it's a governor vanishing to hike the Appalachian Trail, wink, or a president arguing about what the definition of is, the one constant is the sheer audacity of those who think the rules don't apply to them. What makes these scandals so endlessly fascinating isn't just the shock value, it's the way they hold up a funhouse mirror to democracy itself. The whiskey ring showed us corruption could be as institutional as a barrel of bourbon, while Watergate proved even the most powerful man in the world isn't immune to his own paranoia. And let's not forget the Petticoat Affair, where the fate of an administration hinged on who got invited to tea parties. Behind every headline is a reminder that politics isn't some lofty exercise in civics. It's a messy, chaotic, and occasionally hilarious drama starring people who, for all their power, are just as flawed as the rest of us. But here's the kicker: for every scandal that makes the history books, there are a dozen more bubbling under the surface. The next big one could be brewing right now, maybe in a backroom deal, a misplaced email, or a very unfortunate tweet. So keep your popcorn ready, because in American politics, the only predictable thing is the next jaw-dropping reveal. Want to relive the madness? Drop your favorite scandal in the comments, or better yet, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this never-ending saga of power, poor decisions, and oh so entertaining consequences.